before the first king, creation, Eden, and the first mysteries. Imagine opening a book that begins before there are cities, kingdoms, armies, or even human beings. There is no Jerusalem, no Egypt, no Babylon, no Rome. There are not even stars in the sky. There is only darkness, emptiness, and a world that has not yet been shaped. And then comes one of the most famous ideas in ancient literature. Let there be light. The Old Testament does not begin with the story of a nation. It begins with the universe itself. According to Genesis, creation unfolds in stages. Light, the separation of waters, dry land, vegetation, celestial bodies, animals, and finally humanity. For believers, this is the beginning of God's relationship with creation. For historians, the opening chapters of Genesis are also fascinating because they belong to a world where ancient peoples were already asking enormous questions. Where did everything come from? Why does suffering exist? Why do humans die? Why are people capable of both extraordinary kindness and terrible violence? And why does humanity constantly destroy the very world it depends on? Genesis answers these questions through stories. The first human is placed in a garden called Eden. But here is where the story becomes mysterious. The Bible describes rivers associated with the region of Mesopotamia, including the Tigris and Euphrates, that has inspired generations of people to search for a real geographical Eden. Some have placed it in southern Mesopotamia. Others have imagined a region near ancient Persia. Some have even proposed locations far beyond the traditional Near Eastern landscape. But no archaeological expedition has ever proven that a literal Garden of Eden has been found. And perhaps that uncertainty is part of what makes the story powerful. Eden is not simply a location. It represents a world before humanity experienced the consequences of its own choices. At the center of the garden are two trees, the tree of life, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. One command is given: do not eat from the forbidden tree. Then a serpent appears. The strange thing is that Genesis does not immediately call this creature Satan. That identification became much stronger in later Jewish and Christian interpretation. In Genesis, the serpent is simply described as exceptionally cunning. It does not foreceive. It does something more subtle. It asks a question. Did God really say that? That question becomes the beginning of doubt. Eve eats, Adam eats, and suddenly the world changes. The first reaction is not power. It is shame. They hide. They cover themselves. The garden that once felt completely safe becomes a place they can no longer remain. An angel with a flaming sword guards the entrance, and humanity leaves paradise. But Genesis does something unusual here. It does not stop with one dramatic tragedy. It immediately shows the consequences spreading into the next generation. Cain and Abel, two brothers, one farmer, one shepherd, both bring offerings. Abel's offering is accepted. Cain's is not, and Cain becomes angry. God warns him that something dangerous is waiting at the door. Cain ignores the warning. He takes Abel into the field, and humanity's first murder occurs. The story is brutal because Cain does not kill a stranger. He kills his own brother. When God asks where Abel is, Cain answers with one of the most famous questions in Genesis: am I my brother's keeper? The story's answer is effectively yes. Human beings are responsible for one another. But Genesis continues into even stranger territory. Generations pass. People supposedly live extraordinarily long lives. Methuselah is said to reach 969 years. Whether these ages were intended literally, symbolically, or according to an ancient chronological system remains debated. Then comes Enoch. Genesis gives him a strange sentence. He walks with God, and then he is simply gone. There is no ordinary death formula, no dramatic funeral, no explanation, just disappearance. That tiny detail generated centuries of speculation. Later traditions imagined Enoch receiving heavenly revelations. Ancient Jewish literature expanded his story dramatically, but Genesis itself remains silent. Then another mystery appears. The sons of God see the daughters of humans and take them as wives. Who exactly were these sons of God? Angelic beings, powerful rulers, a symbolic representation of ancient humanity. Scholars and theologians have debated the passage for centuries. Then Genesis introduces the Nephilim. The word has become famous in modern popular culture. Giants, supernatural beings, ancient monsters. But the original biblical description is far more limited than many modern stories suggest. The mystery remains, and humanity's condition becomes darker. Violence spreads. Corruption becomes widespread. Then comes the flood. Noah is chosen. He is told to build an enormous ark. The dimensions given in Genesis are surprisingly specific. The ark is described as a huge rectangular structure rather than a normal sailing ship. It has multiple levels and is covered with pitch. Its purpose is not to navigate. Its purpose is to survive. The flood itself has become one of the most famous stories in human civilization. But here is a fascinating fact. Flood traditions existed throughout the ancient Near East. The Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh contains its own story of a catastrophic flood, and a man warned to build a boat. The similarities are remarkable, yet the differences are just as important. In Genesis, the flood becomes a story about judgment, survival, and covenant. When Noah finally leaves the ark, he builds an altar. Then comes the rainbow. It becomes the symbol of a promise that the catastrophe will not be repeated in the same way. But humanity does not suddenly become perfect. It never does. And the next great story proves it. The survivors multiply. They settle. They build. They become ambitious. And eventually they decide to construct a city and a tower reaching toward heaven. Babel. The location is traditionally associated with Mesopotamia. The people want to make a name for themselves. But instead of destroying the tower with an earthquake, the story describes something far more unexpected. Language itself becomes divided. Communication collapses. The project stops. Humanity scatters. And this is one of the central ideas that will appear again and again throughout the Old Testament. Human beings build. Human beings become powerful. Human beings believe they have control. And then something happens that reminds them how fragile that control really is. After Babel, the story becomes smaller. The narrative moves from all humanity to one family. One man, Abraham. And with him, the entire direction of the Old Testament changes. Abraham. The man who walked into the unknown. Abraham does not look like the obvious beginning of a world-changing story. He is not a king. He does not command an empire. He does not live in a palace. He is a nomadic patriarch moving through the ancient Near East with his family, servants, and animals. And then he receives a command. Leave your country. Leave your relatives. Leave the world you know. Go somewhere I will show you. No detailed map. No guaranteed destination. Just go. Abraham goes. According to Genesis, he eventually enters Canaan. But there is an important detail modern retellings sometimes forget. Canaan was already inhabited. There were established cities, agricultural communities, local rulers, and competing cultures. Abraham was entering a world that already existed. He was not walking into an empty wilderness. And his greatest problem was even more personal. He had no heir. God promises that Abraham will become the father of a great nation. But Sarah cannot have children. Years pass, then decades. Nothing happens. Eventually Sarah gives Hagar, her Egyptian servant, to Abraham. Ishmael is born. The story now becomes the beginning of a family conflict that will echo through later religious traditions. But Genesis says the promised son will come through Sarah. Her name is changed from Sarai to Sarah. Abraham becomes Abraham. And eventually, Isaac is born. The name Isaac means laughter, because Sarah had laughed when she first heard that she would have a child. A promise that sounded ridiculous becomes reality. But then Abraham receives the most horrifying command of his life. Take Isaac, the son you waited for, the son through whom the promise is supposed to continue. Take him to the mountain. Offer him. Abraham obeys. The journey takes days. Isaac carries the wood. His father carries the fire and knife. Then Isaac asks the question that makes the entire scene unbearable. Where is the lamb? Abraham answers that God will provide. At the last moment, the sacrifice is stopped. A ram is found. The story becomes one of the most discussed passages in biblical history. Was it about faith? Was it a rejection of child sacrifice? Was it a test of Abraham? Was it meant to establish a theological contrast between Israel's worship and surrounding cultures? Different traditions have interpreted it differently, but the emotional center remains the same. A father is forced to confront whether he trusts the promise more than the thing he values most. Then comes another strange detail. Abraham purchases a burial cave for Sarah. The first major piece of land associated with the patriarchs is not a palace. It is a tomb. That detail is easy to miss. The promised land begins, symbolically, with a grave. Abraham dies. Isaac continues the family. Isaac and Rebekah have twins, Esau and Jacob, and from the moment they appear, they are already fighting. Esau is the older brother. Jacob is the younger. Yet Jacob becomes the central figure. He buys Esau's birthright for food. Later, he deceives his father and receives the blessing intended for Esau. He runs, and during his journey, he dreams of a ladder or stairway reaching toward heaven. Angels move up and down. God speaks. Jacob wakes up and realizes he has encountered something sacred. Years later, Jacob returns toward the land he left. But he knows Esau is coming, and he is terrified. That night, Jacob is alone. Then he wrestles with a mysterious being. The fight continues until morning. Jacob refuses to let go. He demands a blessing, and his name is changed. Jacob becomes Israel. The future nation will carry that name. It is an extraordinary moment. An entire national identity emerges from the story of a man who spent much of his life running, deceiving, and struggling. Jacob walks away injured. He carries a limp. The blessing comes with a scar. Then Jacob has 12 sons, and one of them is Joseph. Joseph will take the story into Egypt, but before he rises to power, he will fall further than almost anyone could imagine. Joseph. From the pit to the palace. Joseph is 17. He is young, favored by his father, and hated by his brothers. He also has dreams. In those dreams, his family appears to bow before him. Whether Joseph understands what these dreams mean is unclear, but telling your jealous brothers that one day they may bow before you is probably not the best family strategy. One day Joseph's brothers find him alone. They decide to kill him. Instead, they throw him into a pit. Then they see a caravan, and suddenly Joseph's life is reduced to a price. They sell him. He disappears into Egypt. His father believes he is dead. Joseph becomes a slave, but the story repeatedly emphasizes something unusual. Joseph continues to rise. He gains responsibility. Then everything collapses again. He is falsely accused by his master's wife. Joseph is imprisoned. A man who once dreamed of greatness now sits behind bars. Years pass, but Joseph interprets dreams. Eventually, Pharaoh himself has disturbing dreams. 7 healthy cows, 7 starving cows, 7 full ears of grain, 7 ruined ears. Joseph interprets them as 7 years of abundance followed by 7 years of famine. Pharaoh believes him. Joseph becomes one of the most powerful men in Egypt. This transformation is one of the most cinematic reversals in Genesis. The prisoner becomes an administrator. The slave becomes a governor. The forgotten brother becomes the man responsible for feeding entire regions. Then famine reaches Canaan. Joseph's brothers arrive in Egypt. They do not recognize him. Joseph recognizes them immediately, and instead of revealing himself, he tests them. He wants to know whether they have changed. Eventually, Judah offers himself in place of Benjamin. That is the moment Joseph breaks. He sends the Egyptians away. He weeps. Then he tells his brothers who he is. The men who sold him are now standing before him powerless. Joseph could destroy them. Instead, he forgives them. And he gives the theological idea that becomes one of Genesis' most important themes. Human beings can intend evil while events can ultimately produce unexpected good. Jacob's family moves to Egypt. The family grows, but eventually Joseph dies. His final request is strange. He does not want his bones permanently left in Egypt. He believes his descendants will one day leave. And they do, but not immediately. Generations pass. A new pharaoh comes to power. He does not remember Joseph. The descendants of Jacob have become numerous, and now Egypt sees them not as guests, but as a threat. Forced labor begins, then persecution, then a decree against Hebrew male infants. A Levite woman hides her baby. She places him in a basket and sends him into the Nile. The child is discovered by Pharaoh's daughter. His name becomes Moses. The irony is almost impossible to miss. The royal household that wants Hebrew children eliminated ends up raising the future leader of the Hebrews. Moses grows up inside the Egyptian world, but as an adult, he witnesses an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. Moses intervenes. An Egyptian dies. Moses runs. The prince becomes a fugitive. He leaves Egypt behind and lives in Midian. For 40 years, Moses disappears from the center of history. Then, at an unexpected moment, everything changes. He sees a bush burning without being consumed. A voice calls his name. Moses. Moses. The man who once ran from Egypt is now told to return. He is 80 years old, and his mission is almost impossible. Confront Pharaoh. Free an enslaved people. Lead them into the wilderness. Moses does not want the job. He asks question after question. Who am I? What if they don't believe me? What if I cannot speak well? God provides Aaron as his spokesman, and Moses returns to Egypt. He walks into Pharaoh's court with an extraordinary demand. Let my people go. Pharaoh refuses, and the conflict begins.